Class, Rick Smith.
And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for being here today on the big program. Lots to get to, lots to talk about as our twiddler-in-chief threw his Trumper tantrum. Yes, our petulant prevaricator had his moment. King Donald giveth, King Donald he doth taketh away. Did sign the executive order that we were expecting, going after targeting the social media platforms, something I think is just plain idiotic and at this point, truthfully, worthless. There's nothing he could actually do without Congress's approval. So this was purely a distraction. This was purely a temper tantrum. This was purely, hey, look at me, I need some attention. Mommy didn't breastfeed me. I mean, that's the only thing I can come up with at this moment. Other than, more than 100,000 people have died because of his because of his failure to meet the challenges of this office. But here we go. You have the Twiddler-in-chief deciding that he didn't like the fact that Twitter actually corrected him and said, hey, maybe you should look at the veracity of the claims made by the guy that is supposed to be our president. And what's interesting is by making this executive order, what he's actually done, because what he's doing is he's taking or claiming to take away certain liability protections. And the reason I started off with Trump giveth and Trump taketh away is because the last executive order he signed gave blanket immunity to the meatpacking industry. So they have liability protections. So he giveth to them, and he's now trying to take the liability protections away from these social media companies who he has abused for so long. So finally, Twitter decides, hey, what you're saying is not completely accurate. It's misleading and it's false. Here are some links that will help you. Because, as we talked about earlier, Trump claimed that California was going to send everyone in the state a ballot. And that's not true. They were going to send registered voters a ballot. You can't say everyone's getting it. No, even the illegals are going to. You can't go there. It's misleading. It's factually wrong. And also that, there's all of this fraud and there's all of this stuff going on. There's a problem with that. There's a problem when the president lies. And it really, it's about time that Twitter did something. Now, personally, I think social media is a giant cesspool that doesn't need a cop on the beat. And I take very little seriously what I hear coming from people. I'm a free speech person, but I also am smart enough to understand, which our president isn't, that these social media platforms are not public domain. If you want to have a conversation of making them public domain, of making them a utility and having government control, we can have that conversation. But they're not. You don't have free speech rights. You don't have the ability to say whatever you want because there are terms of use agreements. And nobody's read them because they're full of legalese. We've got an entire team of lawyers that evidently couldn't convince Trump that this is a waste of time. Other than, we're not talking about the 100,000 plus people that have died because of Trump's failure to deal with the coronavirus. And that's really what this is about. This is pure and simple. This is about distraction. And I'll give you a perfect example. Perfect example is Trump sent out a couple of emails that kind of caught my attention. The first email went out on May 26th to people like me in Pennsylvania that said, the Pennsylvania primary is right around the corner, and now you can vote at home for President Donald Trump. This is the first time that every registered voter in Pennsylvania can avoid the lines by requesting a ballot. Request your ballot and cast your vote from your home. So the campaign is saying, hey, Pennsylvania, you're lucky. You get to stay home and vote for our guy. All you got to do is follow this link and it'll take you right there. the next day sends out another email that, again, must not have remembered the first email, and says, we need to make one thing clear. There is no way that universal mail-in ballot is anything less than substantially fraudulent. Mailboxes will be robbed, ballots will be illegally printed out and forged, and the election will be rigged. So I'm confused as hell on how you can be on all sides of every issue. It's either do it, it's great because you won't have to go stand in line, or it's completely fraudulent because it's, people will do what we've done. Because remember North Carolina's 10th, where you had, literally people going and filling in other people's mail-in ballots. There's something seriously wrong with this logic. But as I've said a number of times, there is no logic here. This is what a tin pot dictator does. It's this kind of all over the map. It's this kind of chaos where you're questioning up or down. You're questioning what is truth. You're questioning what is factual. We've got alternative fact now as a thing to say, well, I don't believe your facts. I've got my own. And we've never been here before. Because the reality is outside of an in-person hand-marked paper ballot, the mail-in ballot is probably the next most secure because your name is on it. And look, there are going to be some shenanigans going on. There always are. There's nothing absolutely 100% perfect. But I do find it interesting that he wants it all ways. But, as I've been saying, we're in this weird kind of moment where you've got a president who wants to distract. You've got somebody who is now really feeling chafed that Twitter had the audacity, the unmitigated gall to actually, slap him on the wrist. And this is, Trump victim syndrome. Because conservatives suffer from this pretty bad. They're always the victim. Stop and think about somebody like Trump for a second. A guy who has had everything handed to him. Literally handed to him from conception forward. And still he's the victim. Everybody's out to get him. Everybody wasn't want him to succeed. Nonsense. You're a dimwit. And this is the problem. The dimwits that follow you think that you're right. And here again, I've had a bunch of people say, well, Rick, you're too hard on him for the coronavirus. And I don't think so. Because, look, did he create it? No. Did he release it? No. But did he act responsibly right from the start? No. Any reasonable, rational leader would have gone, hey, this is serious. Let's take extreme caution in this moment. This guy won't even be seen publicly with a mask on because it might send the wrong message. Maybe we should social distance. And the thing that gets me is we're in this moment where we're finding out more and more about this virus. And remember, it was only going to be old people, the vulnerable, and it was just those people, and we could do without them. We're now finding out that almost half of the new cases in Washington State are people under 40. We're now finding that those folks who we thought were going to be okay, maybe not quite so much. And we're now finding out that there's more stuff, that you can have one idiot who infects a bunch of people. In fact, there's these studies that have just come out, 3 of them, from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Tel Aviv University, and the Institute for Disease Modeling in Washington. They've all basically come to the same conclusion, that about 10% of the people who get sick are responsible for about 80% of the actual infections, which means you have one guy who's like a super spreader. And for whatever reason it is, he's out there spreading it to a bunch of people, whether it's because he breathes heavy or because who knows, skin scales fly off of him. Who knows what it is? But it's a handful of nitwits and ding-dongs who end up screwing it up for the rest of us, which is why I think what happened in Pennsylvania is such an important thing to have brought up. And later in the program, we're going to talk with Representative Pat Harkin about what's going on in our General Assembly, as we had a Republican test positive and didn't tell anybody. And he was exposed to other people like Russ Ding Dong Diamond, who's a representative, not too far from me, who actually showed up to a meeting without wearing a mask because he's that kind of tough guy. These are the problems with having these kind of leaders who are just brain dead. What if you have someone like Ding Dong Diamond, who I've never been a fan of, show up to one of those rallies on the Capitol steps, having been exposed to the virus from someone who had no symptoms at the time that he was possibly sharing it with people. He shows up on the steps and he begins to infect all of those people. And let's say he's one of those super spreaders, because this is the doomsday scenario. This is the scary moment, that you get one of these guys in that crowd and now you've got a massive spike. And then you've got them all hiding it, like the liars and thieves that they are. And it only gets worse, and it only gets worse, until eventually the rest of us are in trouble. And I look at Wisconsin right now. Just 2 weeks ago, you had the big, open them up rallies, and you had the court saying, no, you can't have the stay-at-home order. Yesterday, I guess, was the worst day that they've had so far. They had, an additional 539 new cases. Now you go, it's only 539 people. I go, that's yesterday. What about tomorrow? What about the next day? And what about those people who are walking around that we don't know? This is the problem when you have a handful of these idiots that you see every day, who refuse to wear a mask, who refuse to stay away. And look, we've all come across them. And normally we were like, if I get the cold, I'll be all right. This is something very different. And which is why, again, it's really scary to me. And I had a listener send me a list of some of the southern states, because we're told that the southern states haven't been hit by this, that their death rates are really low, only to find out that the state of Florida from February to May had over 4,200 people die of pneumonia. Now that's really an enormous number when you consider that in 2015 they had 919, in 2016 they had 558, in 2017 they had 944, in 2018 they had 935, and in 2020, miraculously, for some reason, they had 4,259 cases, but they don't have a coronavirus problem. It was pneumonia. And you go, okay, well, that's just Florida, Rick. Well, you look at Texas. Same thing. Texas, 2015, they had 1,067 cases of pneumonia. 2016, 1,027. 2017, 903. 2018, 973. 2020, 4,217. Could it be a coincidence? Must just be a bad flu season. And there are other states doing the same exact thing. They looked at Georgia, same period in Georgia. 15, they had just over 500. 16, 499. 17, 487. 18, 474. This year, 1368. Gee, I could possibly have no idea why that would happen, other than the fact, as I told you from the beginning, they are going to fudge the numbers at every opportunity to keep us stupid, to keep us not understanding what's going on until it's too late. And again, this is why elections absolutely, positively matter. And today on the program, we're going to have a couple people who are running for elected office that I'm hoping folks will get behind. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk with Sarah Riggs Amico. She's running in the U.S. Senate race there in Georgia, an opportunity to pick up not one, but possibly 2 seats in Georgia, which I think would be just fantastic. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Nothing more American than workers standing up, and the union gives a voice to win. on The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1863. That was the day the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry marched through the streets of Boston in a farewell parade and then boarded ships headed for Beaufort, South Carolina. Thousands lined the streets for the send-off, including prominent abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass. It was the first black regiment organized to fight in the Civil War. Abolitionists had wrestled with Lincoln and others that the Civil War wasn't just about preventing national disintegration, but about ending the slave labor system. They were emphatic that slaves and free black men had a right and a vested interest in fighting for their freedoms and the freedoms of their families. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 codified that demand as it abolished the slave system. The Union Army began accepting black enlistees and embarked on recruitment campaigns to enlist future black soldiers. By May, over 1,000 black men had enlisted from 24 states. Others came from as far away as Canada and the Caribbean. Fathers and sons enlisted together. The Union Army was far from free from its own anti-black prejudices. Secretary of War Edward Stanton determined white officers would lead all black regiments. Nonetheless, black enlisted men were trained, armed, and ready to fight. A young Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was put in charge of the regiment. Though Shaw and hundreds of troops would soon be killed in the Battle of Fort Wagner, the regiment forced the Confederacy to abandon the fort altogether. The Swamp Angels, as they were called, would continue to exact justice throughout the South for the duration of the war. They served as a model for other black regiments whose fighting proved decisive for victory. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at laborhistoryin2.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So this November, while having the chance to get rid of our Twiddler-in-Chief, and maybe having a day of peace every once in a while, I'll tell you, that's one of the things that I miss the most about the Obama term. There were days where I didn't even talk about who the president was. It seems like today we can't get past the insanity of today, let alone the things that this president has done over the last 3+ years. But for me, the opportunity to flip the Senate and to start moving us in a very positive direction, really excited about November. Georgia is one of those places that I've been keeping an eye on because there's a chance to pick up 2 Senate seats. And if you pick up both of those Senate seats, there's a really good chance that the Democrats pick up the Senate. They can hold on to the House. Joe Biden wins. Maybe we got a shot at turning things around and using this crisis to make a better tomorrow for our kids. And here to talk about her candidacy, why she's running, on what her plans are for the future, I've asked Sarah Riggs-Amico to come talk with us. She's a senatorial candidate there in the great state of Georgia. Sarah, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm also glad to hear you're following Georgia. I think we're the secret sauce here to flip the U.S. Senate and finally get this country moving in the right direction. Well,
Georgia was one of the places of the last crime. You've got a governor there who I don't think should be seated in that governor's seat. But, again, that's another election that's really questionable. So I've been paying a lot of attention there because there's a lot of growing not happiness. There's a lot of organizing. There's a lot of movement building. And, look, for the future of this country, Georgia could be the way things go.
That's right. And I was very proud to be a part of some of that work in 2018. I was the Democratic nominee here for Lieutenant Governor, running alongside Stacey Abrams. In that race, I got about 500,000 more votes than David Perdue has ever won, our current senator I'm challenging. So we can absolutely flip this seat. And I think it's pretty amazing that here in the Old South, we're running a campaign in which working families, labor, and organizing rights is front and center. I'm very proud to do that. I've spent my entire career in unionized industries. I grew up around union companies. My grandmother only had pay equity with the men who were her colleagues when she joined the union. It's a proud tradition in my family, and I think it's pretty spectacular. We can run that kind of campaign here in Georgia.
Yeah, no, our backgrounds are a little similar. Both from the trucking industry, obviously different ends of it. I driving the trucks down the road, and you being an executive in the offices, but still an important industry for this country. But we've gone to Georgia, and I look at what happens to those port drivers, and I look at what happens to truck drivers across this country, and we've taken what was a solid middle class and a well respected profession, and we've turned it back into sweatshop on wheels.
Yeah, we sure have. And working families, as per usual, are suffering because of it. One of the things that I learned, I ran a car haul company. My family helped save about 4,000 union jobs over the last 12 years in Teamster car haul. So those double decker trucks that move the autos. And when we started, we had 120 employees in the middle of the Great Recession. So nobody thought we would survive, but we believed these were jobs worth fighting for. And if you think about it, back in the 1980s, there were maybe 40 plus union car haulers. We're down to 2. I mean, I've lived with the consequences of right to work. My workers have lived with it. I've seen what it does to families. Instead of becoming an on-ramp to prosperity and access to the American dream, right to work has literally obliterated our multi-employer pensions. It's obliterated organizing rights. And it's really made it hard for those of us who try to do the right thing, who invest in our people, who pay 100% of the health insurance premiums for our workers and their families. It's made it very hard to compete. So in the US Senate, the good news is there's a lot we can do about that, whether it's addressing the PRO Act or getting finally some relief for multi-employer pension funds like the Central States. I don't have to explain to you how critical that is. Or, on the communication worker side, talking about one touch make ready. This is the time. Never has it been more obvious than it is right now in the COVID pandemic, how desperately the US Senate needs a champion for working families, and somebody who's not new to this, but has spent the better part of the last 2 decades putting my money exactly where my mouth is.
Amen. Thank you. And please let the voters of Georgia cast their ballots for Sarah. No, because here's the thing, and a lot of us who have been fighting these fights for quite some time have watched this race to the bottom happen. And it's not because the free market dictated, it's because policies that people who sit in our halls of power have pursued and been bought and paid for to pursue. And to have someone like you in one of those halls of power would be, for me, just an incredible thing, because you understand what it's done to your family as well. It's affected us, but it's affected you as well.
It sure has. I think one of the moments that really made my mind up to run for the US Senate, the pension crisis almost put us out of business last year. And we decided, rather than wait around, try to figure out if Mitch McConnell's going to do his job and fix these multi-employer pensions, the House has done their work, right? They've passed Butch Lewis, so they've at least put something on the table. But rather than wait around, we decided to run after I had a conversation with a Teamster driver named Mark in our Atlanta terminal. And he'd been a driver for us for 44 years, so was no longer driving the big rigs, but he was a shuttle driver in our yard. He was 4 weeks out from retirement, just the nicest man ever, but a tough guy, but Teamster car haulers, they're legit. These guys do tough work and they know it. And he came up to me and said, look, am I going to get my pension? I'm 4 weeks out from retirement. I've paid in every week like I'm supposed to. And I got so choked up, I had a hard time answering him. Working people, this is pension money, let's be clear, is not some sort of entitlement or government giveaway. This is your money. This is the money that working people put away doing exactly what we tell folks they're supposed to prepare and save for their retirement. And I don't ever want to look in a worker's eyes like I did that day again and see somebody who's done everything he's supposed to and feels absolutely broken 4 weeks out from retirement after a 44-year career. And I'm telling you right now, this stuff is fixable. There are solutions out there that will protect the retirement security, the collective bargaining rights, the right to form a union. Sometimes getting that first contract is actually the hardest thing to getting representation or to getting fair wages or retirement benefits. But man, it's all fixable. It's just not fixable with people like David Perdue.
No, I'm right there with you. But here's the weird thing. We don't seem to have a problem, and Mitch McConnell doesn't seem to have a problem with creating a $500 billion slush fund for Wall Street and big corporate special interests, while allowing that worker to worry about, is he going to be able to have any type of retirement security whatsoever? Because we've continually bailed Wall Street out at every opportunity. We write blank checks like crazy, but to give working people just that little bit of security, I guess is a bridge too far.
Yeah, just remember these Republicans, the same Senate Republicans who went on vacation, went to recess last August instead of take up the Butch Lewis Pension Relief Act. These are the guys that work through Christmas holidays and recess all the time trying to pass tax cuts for billionaires or take away health care from poor folks by ending the Affordable Care Act. I mean, they're happy to work through vacation when it comes time to help their donors. They just don't want to help the little guy. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm tired of it. I stepped down from the company specifically to run full time for this seat because we can't take having people like David Perdue in the Senate anymore. This guy made his career and his millions on the backs of working people, outsourcing jobs overseas, cutting wages and benefits, busting unions. It's time for that to stop. We're asking folks who make darn near minimum wage now to become essential workers and put their lives at risk on the front line of this pandemic to keep our families fed and our country going. And it's time that they had a fair shot in this economy.
You're listening to the Rick Smith Show. We're here with Sarah Riggs Amico. She is running for Senate in the state of Georgia. Check out her website, sarahforgeorgia.com. We'll get links out on social media, how you can do that. You can also follow her at Sarah Riggs Amico there on Twitter. We'll also make sure we get the opportunity to see that. Now, we can talk about the worker side of this all day because this is right in my wheelhouse. But some of the other things I wanted to hit on, because Georgia is a no rights at work state. How do you go about, how would you pursue undoing the damage that's already been done and revive that thing that I grew up believing in, that if you worked hard, you played by the rules, and that you'd get ahead? That's not true anymore. How do we revive that, and what do you do to pursue that?
Yeah, the first thing we've got to do is pass the PRO Act. We've got to protect the right to organize for working people. This also does things like streamline the NLRB elections process that stiffens the penalties for companies that cheat in the process. This is not just good for workers. I would argue it's good for business. Nobody wants to be the business person, at least not in my family, not the way I grew up. Nobody wants to be the business person who made their money by mistreating their workers. This is how we create an economy that actually works for everyone. We've also got to address the multi-employer pension crisis. 1,400 multi-employer pensions in this country, and 125 of them are projected to collapse in the next 2 decades. This is a crisis of epic proportions, and the U.S. Senate is sitting on its hands and doing nothing. It's unacceptable. In the communications space, construction space, building trades, we've got to look at employee misclassification, but we've also got to look at this one-touch make-ready policy that's affecting our linemen, our poll workers. This is a big deal for the communications workers. So we've got to start with those blocking and tackling, but we've also got to address minimum wage, even for people that aren't in a union. Here in Georgia, $5.25 an hour is still the minimum wage for non-Fair Labor Standards Act jobs. That's just unacceptable. And for tipped workers, we're still asking them to make $2 and change plus tips. And those are the same folks we're expecting to put their health and their family at risk by going back to work right now.
Yeah, the people we're calling frontline heroes and essential. And it's kind of amazing that we would allow them to starve and we would allow them to end up homeless and uninsured. And this is the other part of this. As an employer, when you were in charge of the company that you were in charge of, healthcare costs are just getting completely out of hand. I've been on the side where the union is negotiating healthcare benefits, and that eats up a good portion of any wage increase that people could get. How do we deal with the healthcare issue? I don't know where you stand. If you're a Medicare for all person, if you like the system as is, where do you find yourself?
Yeah, so in our business, we made the decision to pay 100% of the health insurance premiums for all our workers and their families, just full stop. It's not fair to pass those costs along to folks. But what we can do in the U.S. Senate is a number of things. First and foremost, we have got to move toward universal health care coverage. No one in this country should be sick because they are poor, and nobody should be poor because they got sick. We've got to add a public option immediately. We've got to reopen the exchanges so that people in this pandemic who lose their jobs and their health care can be covered. We've got to make sure all 50 states expand Medicaid. And that may mean that the federal reimbursement rate for Medicaid expansion has to go up to 100 cents on the dollar. That takes away the excuse from Republicans like Brian Kemp, who refuse to look at the economic or moral argument for expanding Medicaid. It'll save our rural hospitals. It'll cover more folks. We've got to also redefine poverty in this nation. For too long, we have not expanded the safety net that is Medicaid, the health insurance program for low-income families. And it's absolutely critical now more than ever that we do that. We can also lower the Medicare eligibility age probably to 55 or 60. And I think there are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained in that too. So the answer is there are many solutions, Rick. The problem is that we have a Republican majority that thinks it's their job to substitute their preferences and their politics for the will of tens of millions of Americans around this country who want action on these issues.
Right.
And I think that also means we have to continue, again, to address labor and organizing rights, because when you can collectively bargain, you can sit at the table and ensure your workers are protected, ensure there's a safe workplace. I'm very proud to be the only candidate running for U.S. Senate in either of the two races in Georgia that has the backing of labor unions. 5 so far, plus the head of our national negotiating committee for the Teamsters in my industry. It's the ultimate compliment. The guy that sat across the table from me for a decade negotiating to earn his endorsement in this race was probably one of my proudest moments. And the reason he did it is because he doesn't have to ask where I stand on these issues. He knows I've been fighting for working families for 17 years since I started this career.
And good on you, and we're grateful for that. But from a business perspective, because we can make all the moral arguments about why universal health care is important and why we need to make sure that everyone has access. I argue from cradle to grave. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but from a business perspective, because I have a lot of my conservatives go, your socialism is not going to work. We need business solutions. Why is this a good business solution?
Yeah, I want to be absolutely clear, by the way. I have a master's in business administration. I've been a business owner. It's utterly laughable that anybody would think I fall into the socialism scare tactics that the Republicans are intent on pushing. But I do think it's important that we explain to people, as a business person, why is the healthcare situation in the United States making our companies and our workers less competitive? And in our business, we had operations also in Canada. We didn't have to worry about competing with non-union carriers or other companies because it's national healthcare, right? That the cost factor of healthcare, which might be on average 7% of a company's operating budget in the United States, that never comes into play. And by the way, in Canada, you also have the pensions. And unions, are sort of the norm in our business there. We weren't necessarily in a race to the bottom on prices like you see in right to work states here in the United States. So I would say the healthcare piece is critical. You don't want somebody sitting in their job, whatever it is, thinking about whether they can afford to take their kid to the doctor, thinking about whether they're one slip, trip, or fall away from a medical emergency that becomes a financial emergency for their family.
Yeah.
This is something that is making our businesses less competitive. And I think it's also, unfortunately, created a system where the folks, the good guys, the businesses that want to take care of their workers, they're at a cost disadvantage.
That's the
so
point.
It's time to level the field.
And that's one of the main points I make, because the good actors are the ones who end up getting cheated and end up being out of the game. And the bad actors, the people who want to race us to the bottom, they're the ones who end up, lining their pockets at the expense of the rest of us. You listen to the Rick Smith Show. We're here with Sarah Riggs Amico. She's a senatorial candidate there in the state of Georgia. Her website, sarahforgeorgia.com. Make sure you check that out. Maybe throw her a couple bucks. These are expensive races. Sarah, I wanted to ask a couple of real quick questions about some stuff going on today. I don't know if you're following what's going on in Minnesota. But you've got another horribly tragic situation where a black man gets killed by a policeman. Now we've got people in the streets. We've got chaos, and yet we've got a president that I don't think he's really said anything. And yet we've also got people in state capitals with long guns and protests where there doesn't seem to be any chaos. We're in this weird kind of moment with race relations in this country, and I look to you. I look to Georgia. Is there some sanity forward? Is there a way forward in what we're living through?
Yeah, there absolutely is. Look, the COVID pandemic and what happened in Minnesota, for that matter, what happened in Brunswick, Georgia with Ahmaud Arbery, an unarmed black man who went out for a jog and was hunted down by 3 white men who then videotaped him being shot to death. It doesn't have to be this way. These are really challenging times. These are tough things to watch. But I want to be clear, this is a direct failure of the leaders we have who serve us. We can do something about this, but we have to face up to a country that, we built a lot of this nation and its economy on the backs of enslaved labor, on lands that were confiscated from indigenous peoples. These are deep, deep wounds on race, privilege, class, gender in our nation. And it's going to require some really honest conversation about who we want to be going forward. You know, I don't want my daughters to grow up in a world where the color of your skin, how much money your parents had, your sexual orientation, your gender identity determines who you love, how or if you pray. All these things determine whether or not you have access to the right healthcare, the right education, the right economic opportunity, or whether you really have equality under the law. And guys, for better or worse, the COVID period, along with the events in Brunswick, Georgia, and in Minnesota, and in so many other cases, Breonna Taylor, it's just, you know, it's all of these cases are forcing us now to look at this. In America, we've got a moment to choose. You know, do we want to regress to the same systems of structural inequity by race and gender and class and privilege? Or do we want to dig out the root causes here and fix this stuff so that our kids grow up in a world where everyone is truly equal under the law, where everyone has access to the American dream? And that's going to be a tough and painful conversation. But man, Rick, I got to tell you, I think it's necessary. And I don't think any of us, you know, should stop talking about this until it changes. How many unarmed Black men and women do we have to see die at the hands of police before policing reform becomes something we talk about until it's fixed?
Right. No, I'm right there with you, and the militarization of our police forces is something that's really concerning. But also the militarization of our society. You've got all of these armed gun nuts running around in state capitals, you know, having their show of force. They weren't out there to protest or lobby. They were out there to show force. And what's interesting to me is you look at what's going on in Minnesota and other places. You can go to Ferguson or Detroit or anywhere, and you see the police response to these folks. And I was watching the faces of the policemen being screamed at by these militia nuts, and there wasn't the same kind of response. And I'm curious how we get past that.
Yeah, look, Mr. Floyd, you know, unfortunately, we've all seen the video, right? This is somebody who has his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, who's commissioned and paid by taxpayers to serve and protect. So what we can do is a number of things. You know, the Department of Justice must be involved here. This merits a full investigation. We need to know the work histories. We need to understand if there were failings within the city or the police department's management that led to a culture that was toxic. And we need to understand also where do we start earlier in the process? How can we make it so that the color of somebody's skin doesn't instantly instill fear in certain individuals and certain law enforcement officers, for sure. Right. Think about it. You know, the woman who was playing video games in her own apartment with her 8-year-old nephew, shot through the window of her own home. The gentleman who was eating ice cream in his apartment, and a police officer mistakenly entered his apartment instead of her own and shot him to death. There's just there's a deep-seated need in this country to take a look in the mirror. And I would say not just for communities of color, but for white folks, we've got to figure out how to do allyship right. We've got to figure out how to stand with people of color, communities of color, in a way that says, I'm here, how can I advocate? How can I help? What can I do? And it's not enough just to say, I'm not racist. Right? The anti-racist movement, this is important. You have to be actively beating back these injustices. It's not enough to just say, well, not me, or not all white people. You need to go out and be a part of the change. And I think in some instances that means different things for different people. It means marching in the streets. It means running for office for some of us. But it means the conversations we have with our kids from the time they're old enough to talk about this have to be deep on issues of justice and race and the intersection with inequality in our country.
Or even just as little as voting against racist politicians and throwing some of these bums out. Last question I've got for you. Obviously the Teddy Kennedy question. Why Sarah? Why do people of Georgia want Sarah?
Yeah, look, we're going to be in an economic crisis in November. And I hate to say it, but we're approaching 40 million Americans who've lost their job in the last few months. Just by comparison, 8.6 million initial jobless claims in the entirety of the Great Recession. This is going to be a long, long recovery, and it's going to be a painful one. Some of these jobs may not come back. The nature of some of these businesses and jobs may change. And who sits in that U.S. Senate seat is going to be extremely important in terms of who gets the first position in line in how that recovery shapes up. You know, are working people finally at the front of the line, or are they still an afterthought to the GOP donor class? And if you want somebody who's been a battle-tested, ass-kicking champion for working people for the last 2 decades, I'm the only candidate who can say that in this race. There's a lot of good Democrats in Georgia. We're lucky. But there's only one of us that's already run statewide, already gotten almost 500,000 more votes than the incumbent Republican has ever done. Only one of us that can go toe-to-toe with him on jobs and the economy and protecting working people. And that's what I do. That's my family. We help rescue broken businesses, and we do it in partnership with our unions. And we're proud of that legacy. That's why I'm proud to be the only labor-backed candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of Georgia.
Good stuff. Sarah, I appreciate the time. I wish you nothing but the best. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again. Keep up the fight, and we're pulling for you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Good stuff. Sarah Riggs Amico. Make sure you check out her website, sarahforgeorgia.com. That's it. Also, all the social media platforms. And if you got a couple of bucks, throw it her way. Like I said, these races are expensive. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You listen to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1882. That was the day that John Muir, a Scottish-American conservationist, founded the Sierra Club in San Francisco, California. The Sierra Club's purpose was to explore, enjoy, and protect the wild places of the earth. Today, the organization has more than 1 million members and is one of the most well-known environmental organizations on the planet. The labor movement and the environmental movements in the United States have not always had an easy relationship. Too often, politicians and the media have framed policy decisions as a choice between good jobs and a clean environment. But during the 1990s, some environmentalists and unionists began to break down this divide. Both groups opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement, arguing it would have a negative impact on both jobs and the environment. During the massive protests of the World Trade Organization in 1999 in Seattle, labor protested alongside environmental activists. One memorable tagline to come out of the protest was, "Turtles love Teamsters, Teamsters love turtles." Then, in 2006, the Sierra Club partnered with the United Steelworkers to launch the Blue-Green Alliance. The effort joins together blue-collar workers with green environmental justice groups. The partnership seeks to supply policy and education about sustainable job growth in fields such as clean energy. Multiple environmental groups and unions, including the American Federation of Teachers, the Communication Workers of America, the Service Employees International Union, and the United Auto Workers, have signed on to the effort. But it's not always easy to keep the two causes united. In 2012, the Laborers Union left the alliance due to disagreements over the Keystone XL pipeline. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
I got to tell you, it would be fantastic. Seriously, it would be fantastic to have someone like Sarah in the U.S. Senate standing up for working people. Because look, I look at a place like Georgia, and when we did our civil rights tour, we ended up going through Savannah and had the opportunity to sit down with a bunch of the port truck drivers down there. And the exploitation of these drivers, because all of them were labeled independent contractors. They were their own boss. So there was no minimum wage. There was no maximum hour other than the DOT laws that they were responsible for, not the company. And the company was always pushing them to break those laws because, hey, we got to get those containers moved. And I remember one guy that, he showed me a paycheck that he had worked an entire week, 70 hours. And ended up with like 80 cents. Because after they took out the lease of the truck, they took out evidently some fine that they assessed to him for taking the wrong dolly and there all kinds of stuff, insurance and all of the maintenance and all of this. He got like 90 cents. It was ridiculous. But this is what's happened. This is what's been allowed to happen. And to hear someone like Sarah talk about, trying to run a business in that environment in the trucking industry, which has been, just cutthroat, and to have someone from Georgia who's going to go into the U.S. Senate and say, you know what, we really do need to protect workers' rights. We do really need to address these no rights at work laws. We need to give the people an opportunity to, fight for that better tomorrow. To fight for better wages, hours, conditions. To have a say in the workplace, to have a say in their safety, to have a say in the conditions under which they toil. And this is one of the things that I've been talking about for a while. You look at the fact that Donald Trump has given blanket immunity to these meatpacking companies. And nothing for the workforce, nothing for the people who have to get up every day and go and punch those clocks and have to go and do the work and have to be the ones who are going to, bear the responsibility and, the danger. Which is why when I heard this story out of Tennessee, where a worker who was standing up, was fighting, saying, look, hey, we want a safer working condition. We want a better place for us to work and a better place that's going to be safe. Evidently he was fired. And that's why I've asked him to come on the program and share some thoughts on how we got to this point. That's why I've asked Daniel Stone to come talk with us. He is, according to the reports, a worker who was fired by Dollar General because he had the audacity, the unmitigated gall to ask for safer working conditions. Daniel, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, Rick, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm good. So walk me through this. Explain what happened.
Well, as you mentioned, I think corporate doesn't exactly like their own speaking out against the conditions that their coworkers in stores and elsewhere are going through. And in early March, I started sending some emails to senior executives as well as human resources asking about paid sick leave and hazard pay and just some of the things that we as workers deserve and demand and are no longer asking for. And, they didn't like that. So me as a corporate employee, after seeing the tens of thousands of dollars that higher ups within corporate and directors and the executive team are getting millions, and hearing stories from people who couldn't feed their children, who were afraid to take this virus home, who were being given T-shirt masks, literal T-shirts cut into masks, whereas corporate workers were able to get standard wired masks, disposable ones. We acted. So that came to fruition in late April for me when they called me and told me that because of what they thought were negative emails as well as bad blood between myself and the company, they said, you're done. But our fight didn't end there. We started working with the UFCW. Myself and local UFCW 655 filed a charge of an unfair labor practice against Dollar General because workers in this country have a right to organize. They did a lot of good things in the 30s, and one of them was passing a law that allows us as workers to get together and to unionize. Correct. And to have that right to do so. So we filed a charge, and we're waiting to hear back on June 2nd what the evidence will be. The Dollar General thinks they have evidence against me, but we know the truth, and that's what I was terminated because I was engaging in union activity alongside my coworkers.
Yeah, but here's the sad reality. We're in a moment where you've got Donald Trump as president and an NLRB that is decidedly corporate-minded, and the fear becomes, and good on you for standing up and speaking out, and honestly, using the quote-unquote open door policy that they always tell us that they believe in, even if they don't. But my fear is that with who we have in the White House, our rights don't matter.
You're right. I think there is a part of me that feels like we're maybe starting behind the eight ball with respect to, like you say, they're more geared towards the corporate side of things. But with that in mind, obviously I'm confident that we're going to win. We wouldn't have filed it if we didn't think that we had a good case. And on the other side of it, I think maybe being on programs like yours and others, raising awareness that, there are corporate workers who understand that we are equal to our coworkers in grocery stores and distribution centers. We don't share the same belief that we're above them as some people higher up than us have. So, when they tried to silence me and the movement that we've created, in all actualhood, they've just opened a door to more and more people within their building who are doing the same exact things I did.
Right.
They think that I'm the only one. Not at all. So they've got a lot to deal with after this case, win or loss.
No, and here's the reason I think it's important for folks like you to speak out, because some people would just go away and, okay, fine, I'm going to go do something else. I'm not going to deal with this anyway. But the reason that you've been fighting this and speaking out, why I think it's so important, is a message for others that the little guy can take on these behemoths, that there are people on your side, and that there's a shot that, hey, you can hold them responsible.
I completely agree. I think that it's going to take a lot of us to sacrifice a part of ourselves for the greater cause, and that my cost here, as I've been told, obviously, is I lost my job, and a whole other situation is I lost my health insurance. That doesn't happen in other major countries. It only happens here.
Right.
That the risk you take in standing up for things like this is not only your income, but your security with regards to your health. And, I've seen, obviously, the people who are working in stores and working in distribution centers every day are putting their lives on the line. So I think when we have a unified front with respect to the labor movement, we're a force to be reckoned with, genuinely.
No, I look at someone like you, Dan, a younger guy. I look at your generation and I go, hey, I'm hoping that your generation gets it where maybe mine didn't as well. That we do need the labor movement, that you do need collective bargaining, you do need collective action. And, because look, as a kid, I was trained, communism's bad, socialism's bad, it's all bad. And really, allowed, politicians to destroy our rights on the job and to take them away and hand them over to corporate interests. And I'm hoping the generation coming up behind us is smart enough to realize that, we need those things.
I really think that there is a palpable change in how we view one another with respect to my generation, the younger generation, and not to say that my parents' generation is absent of that, but I really think that there's a large communal aspect to the actions that my generation is taking that will put in place a lot of the future protections for workers. I'm a new uncle. As of 4 months, and the things that I did with other Dollar General workers and elsewhere was to ensure that when she becomes of age to work, she's not taken advantage of by corporations who will put out PR pieces claiming that she's a hero with light piano music and a black and white filter while giving the CEO and the executive team $20 million plus. When people like her working in store and can't afford to feed her children, can't afford to go home, and they're not thinking, can I order out tonight? It's, can I afford ramen to cook on the stove? These are actualities that workers in this country have to deal with. They're not outliers. It's not a one-off. It's what people deal with every day.
And it's not just during times of pandemic or crisis. It's every day, and it's not gotten any better as the years have gone on. And one of my hopes is, out of this suffering, out of this chaos, out of this crisis, comes more voices like Daniel Stone, who's going to step forward and say, "I've had enough of you know what, and we're not taking it anymore, and we're going to join together and make." And you use the word that I liked, demands. We demand better treatment. We demand better conditions. We demand better wages. We demand better health care. We demand better for the wealth that our labor creates.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, it's come to a point with respect to the labor movement that we no longer can be afraid to fight fire with fire. When corporations see that the morality that we share amongst ourselves and our communities, whereas I say it elsewhere, is like, you may afford patience to your family, you afford kindness to your family, humor, and all these aspects that we apply as a community to one another. Corporations see that, and they see an opportunity to exploit it. They see a chance to wedge their way in and create either PR or ineffective distribution of wealth to their workers and pretend that they're on your side. Well, I think one thing that we have to do going forward in the labor movement is to no longer apply our morality to corporations because they don't share it. They exploit it. Like I mentioned, whereas you may have those affectionate feelings towards workers and elsewhere, the corporate entities are not seeing you in the same vein. We're not on the same plane. They see an opportunity to exploit what you feel and what you believe, and we can't allow that anymore.
No, I'm right there with you. So what do you say to these folks around the country? Because we've had Amazon workers on the program. We've had people who are trying to figure out how they're going to begin organizing. What advice do you give to other workers who are in the same situation you were in? Look, they have to go to work. They don't have a choice. They have to go to work in conditions that might be safe, might not be. They don't know. What advice do you give folks?
I think it's two fronts or 2 points of advice rather. One is, I've been working with people like Chris Smalls of Amazon. He was terminated for similar things.
Right.
And we are working directly on a day of action in June with workers across multiple companies and chains. And I think that's critical, is to be able to, if you're someone at Dollar General, obviously feel free to reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to help you. But if you're an Amazon or McDonald's or something else, there are leaders like SEIU, the UFCW, and other established groups who can give you tools to better organize in your workplace. And, that's one piece of it, is to actually demand a contract from your employer to say, you cannot change my wage, you cannot reduce my hours. A contract is essential to workers going forward. But then it's like I mentioned earlier, we cannot be afraid to say, okay, you're not protecting me. You're not paying me. I'm risking my family's health by coming here. It's time I act. And maybe showing a little bit of solidarity hand in hand with people and walking out and saying enough is enough, workers taking back the power is useful. Right. We have to do two sides of the coin, and that is to professionally attack with respect to contracts and unions. And then the other side is to say, is recognizing our power and exerting it in the sense of walkouts, strikes, and everything, and other things that have worked throughout history.
No, you're absolutely right. I've called for a general strike a couple of times over the years when it was necessary, and I think we're getting to that point right now, especially as you look at the number of positive cases in our meatpacking plants across the country continue to rise, and people are getting sick. While you've got a president who gave these companies blanket immunity,
exactly,
we've got to be standing with each other, and it's not enough to go, hey, good luck. We've got to be going back to the days of sympathy strikes and solidarity strikes, and be standing with each other and boycotting when we have to, and making sure that we're all in this together. Because the sad reality is, as you guys suffer, as warehouse workers and fast food workers and Amazon workers, as they suffer, we all end up suffering for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one key component of everything, is why I've tried to use the platform that I have to amplify as many workers' stories as possible. And I've been open about it, as a corporate employee, one of the things that I recognized was the most, unfair was that I, as a corporate employee, what makes me more valuable to that company than the people who are putting their lives on the line? People in New Jersey who are working in stores having to make their own hand sanitizer and protect themselves with handkerchiefs and T-shirt cutouts. How in the world can a company consciously and morally delve out tens of thousands of dollars to people who are working from home, with respect to directors, watching Netflix at 2 p.m, working on their laptop from the security of their home? I don't understand how a company who claims to serve others can be so disingenuous to its own workforce.
Well, we've seen it over the years, Daniel. The reality is they don't view us as actual human beings, and we saw it this week where you had one of the White House economic advisors saying that we're human capital stock. We're not actually workers. So last thing I've got, the last question I've got for you, because the community is so important in all of this. What kind of response have you gotten from folks? Because you're in Tennessee, one of the no rights at work states. What kind of response have you gotten from the people around you?
Yeah, it's fun. I never expected on January 1st of 2020 to be sitting here talking to you about these things, of course. And it has been very humbling for myself, obviously, to see the outpouring of support from friends, family, and strangers across multiple channels, states, countries. And one thing I've always been redirecting people to is to support your workers' advocacy groups in your area. In Nashville, we have a wonderful one with Workers' Dignity, as well as others who just do amazing work for people who are actually on the ground.
Right.
The reception has been great from the public and people I worked with. People inside the building, who have privately messaged me on Twitter and elsewhere who would say, like, hey, I just want you to know we're carrying your torch. We're continuing this work from the inside. So I would encourage people to maintain the support of the workers. And we did set up a GoFundMe for obviously myself, as well as we're giving 20% away of the total funds to workers, to Dollar General workers, just putting cash in their hand because we know that Dollar General is giving them zero. So that's what I mean. I think if there's any takeaway that a listener, someone from my hearing this story would be, we cannot any longer apply our morality to corporations. They do not share it. They exploit it. We have to move on from wanting a benevolent corporation to exist because they don't. So
excellent and perfect messaging. And make sure you get us a link to how we can put it out on social media where we can help those GoFundMe pages. But Daniel, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the work you'll do. I hope you'll come back as your June activity ramps up and keep us abreast of what's going on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And, hopefully we'll have an update for you on June 2nd. And then everyone, please be sure to follow myself or Chris Smalls on Twitter to follow up with a day of walkout and a day of action, because, this isn't stopping. This will never stop. We're in solidarity together. So
good stuff.
Thank you for having me on.
Good stuff, Daniel. Appreciate it. Daniel Stone. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
Charles Dickens, writing about the inequality and social turmoil that led to the French Revolution, noted that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So it is today with a horrific COVID-19 crisis. Consider the bad experiences of one especially hard-hit group in our country, the Navajo Nation, which has become a hotspot of COVID deaths. Making it worse, Trump officials delayed disbursement of $8 billion in coronavirus relief funds set aside for tribal governments. So the disease raged through Indian country for 6 crucial weeks while the Trumpsters sat on the money. In another screw-up, accentuating the worst of times, an Indian health agency in Seattle urgently requested medical supplies, but good grief, what they got was a shipment of body bags, complete with tags that read, "attached to tow." Yet, in an example of the best of times, an especially poignant gesture came when the Navajo Nation sought donations to help deal with the spreading virus. The fund quickly surged past $3 million, mostly because of small dollar amounts pouring in from a surprising source, Irish people. Huh? A little history. In 1847, during the potato famine that killed 1 million Irish and forced another 1 million to emigrate, a modest donation of $170 arrived, lifting the entire nation's spirit because it was sent by the equally impoverished and suffering people of the Choctaw Nation, 4,000 miles away in Oklahoma. This act of deep humanitarian empathy created a special bond between Irish and Native American people that has endured ever since. This is Jim Hightower saying, the Choctaw have a word, Iakawa, that means serving those in need. That's what turns the worst of times into the best, and we need more of it.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So back in March, a 52-year-old emergency physician at the Bellingham Hospital in Washington was fired. Evidently, they didn't like what he was saying about, I don't know, how horrible conditions were on the job, because this whistleblower was saying, hey, we got problems. They were publicly protesting what he called inadequate workplace measures to protect the workers there. Well, the American Civil Liberties Union attorneys have filed suit against Peace Health and the St. Joseph's Medical Center there to reinstate and also pay damages to Dr. Lin. And this is, again, another one of these moments where I keep coming back to not only do Dollar General warehouse workers and Amazon workers and fast food workers need unions, but physicians do too. And this is another example of why I think that is the case. Anyway, here to give us an update on where we are with the coronavirus and where with the reopening and all the stuff going on, to get a little bit of information, which is why we've asked our medical expert, Dr. Kelly Senholz, to come talk with us. Kelly, thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you. And I guess solidarity is the word of the day.
Most certainly. And in more places than just the workplace.
Absolutely. Right now, as we're talking, about a mile from my house, protesters have shut down I-25, which is the only main north-south thoroughfare in Denver, in protest, in solidarity with Minneapolis, and I'm so proud of them.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into this weird kind of world where, I fear violence in the streets every day.
Well, you know what, though? I think we're headed for that no matter what.
Yeah.
And I think it's time for people to get up and say what they want and what they need and stop being afraid, stop cowering in their houses, stop letting 100,000 people die because you don't want to seem too, loud by speaking your mind. It's time for people to stop being afraid.
Right.
Because clearly they're willing to kill us.
Oh, no, absolutely. So let me ask you this, because you've got all these protests going on. And of course, I've got some people going, well, hey, but Rick, you're talking about social distancing and you're talking about staying away from people. But here you got all these people out there, and they're rioting, they're looting.
Well, you know what? You can riot with a mask on. I highly recommend everybody going out and protesting wear a mask. Also, stay 6 feet away from people if you can. There's absolutely no reason why people can't do that. If they can do it in the park for exercise, they can do it outside for protesting. It's a little hard if you find yourself getting pushed together with a bunch of people.
Right.
You need to, keep your eyes open and step back from that. Don't let that happen. But there's no reason why folks can't go out and have their say.
Or if the police end up kettling you and wrapping you in a big fence unit like they do. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is I wanted to ask you about some weird things that have come across my desk. Evidently, some pneumonia numbers in a lot of southern states seem to be kind of out of whack. And I looked through these earlier. Florida, for instance, is claiming to have so far this year 4,259 cases of people dying from pneumonia. Where over the last, since 2015, they haven't gone over 1,000. Same thing in Texas, same kind of thing in Georgia, where the numbers are just so badly skewed. Is it possible that these folks actually, died because of the coronavirus, and we're just not classifying them that way?
I think it's not only possible, but it's the obvious reason. It's absolutely true that we can look back over several years. There may be some variation from year to year on how many people die at home or how many people die of pneumonia. But when you have a jump of 3 times as many people with no other obvious explanation but COVID, I think you would be hard-pressed to not say those were COVID patients.
Right. Because, we're hearing, especially from my daughter, that, it hasn't really done what everyone said it was. 100,000 is bad, but, they were saying it was going to be 1 million. Is this an example of, the success of doing what we did early on, or, as early as we did, didn't cause things to be even worse than they were? Because look, we've seen the studies that have come out. Had Trump acted just a week earlier, 40% of the people who died because of this would not have. Had he acted 2 weeks earlier, something like 60% of the people wouldn't have died. And so on. The sooner that they would have reacted, the less death and carnage we would have had. But even at 100,000, isn't that kind of? I mean, it's weird to say, but kind of almost a success on a certain level.
No, it's not a success. I was looking up whether we've ever had this kind of a massive death of Americans in our entire history. And the answer is no, except for one thing. In October of the year 1918, from the flu pandemic, there were 200,000 deaths. If someone else has other information, let me know. But that is the only other time we've had this many deaths in our country at once. Our country absolutely flipped out when 9/11 happened and we lost thousands of Americans. It was horrible. But here we are having lost, many times that many, and it seems to be a slow burn. I mean, here's the big problem. In the first pandemic in 1918, we had a rise in the spring, just like we just did. It kind of burned over the summer, and then in the fall, it went crazy. Our population is much larger now, much more interconnected, and one can only imagine if Trump continues to do what he's doing, right, which I see no other end in sight. We're talking about a really horrific thing happening in the fall. And we talked about this before, I think it was in February and maybe March when I spoke with you and said, every minute counts. Every day that Trump refuses to put us in lockdown, thousands of people will die downstream.
Right.
And now we have a study showing that was exactly what happens. This is basic math.
Yeah, it's basic.
It was clear then.
Yeah, it's basic sense. And had he had someone maybe like you advising him, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But here's my big concern, and we're seeing all of these images from around the country, in the Ozarks, where you got tons of people, at the beach, and you've got people, all over, the bars and all over the place, and most of them not wearing masks. I see these 3 studies that have come out at the London School of Hygiene, the Tel Aviv University, and the Institute of Disease Modeling, and they're saying that about roughly 10% of the COVID cases appear to cause about 80% of the new infections. And they're talking about the idea that there's these super spreaders out there to where you could have literally one guy go through a huge crowd and a whole bunch of these people. I think the one in South Korea said up to 55 people were infected because of one person. And this is the kind of thing that worries me about going back to, life as usual and in big crowds and thinking this was all a hoax.
We really have a big problem because those super spreaders are going to be all kinds of workers. If I work in a cafe and I've got hundreds of people coming in a day, the odds are that I'm going to wait on somebody that has COVID. If they sit in that booth for an hour spewing droplets into the air and I walk by, my chance of getting infected is high. But the other side of that coin is I'm also going to be contacting hundreds and hundreds of people over the next weeks before I get symptoms, or if I even get symptoms. So that I would say every restaurant that's open where people are inside are at risk of having a super spreader. Every hair salon that has somebody inside is at risk of a super spreader. Just today, a lady told me her hair salon, they ended up having someone testing positive. How many people did that person serve before they found out they were positive? So this is like a microcosm of what's happening all over the country. The World Health Organization said, this is not a second peak we may be having because we never stopped the first peak. the United States has continued to have increasing numbers of cases.
Right.
So this is not a second peak. We're still in the first peak.
And that's, I said a while ago that we would see the attack on the numbers, that Trump and Republican governors were going to do everything they can do to make it not look bad. I pointed to the numbers of deaths of pneumonia in these southern states that are just completely off the charts and for no reason completely off the charts other than they're deliberately misclassifying them. But my fear is that it's only about, hey, they just want to get reelected. They don't care how many people die. They don't care how much chaos and how much pain and suffering. It's just about getting reelected in November.
Unfortunately, the people in the United States have been taught to trust our leaders, and we've blindly trusted them. And, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when it was more than clear they were not trustworthy, people still resisted not being able to trust them because it's the foundation of everything we do. Our legal system, our medical system, our banking system, all of it is built on trust. And if we lose that, it's just massive. And the citizens have been resistant to releasing their trust. But I think today in Minnesota, we've got some people realizing that, you just cannot go on having murderers as police people or having liars as politicians. They're lying to us openly and unabashedly. They don't even try to hide it really anymore. That's how bad it is.
And that's the really frustrating part in all this. And that's why, again, elections have consequences and why this upcoming election is so important. And we need people to come out in overwhelming numbers so that even if there are shenanigans going on, that maybe you're able to surpass whatever shenanigans are going on. Last question I've got for you. We're in this reopening. I think people are, going back to their lives. I've had people tell me that, they've gone into stores and people they've known for years, I've told them, take that stupid mask off. There's now this kind of, almost like a massive divide over mask wearers and non-mask wearers. What advice do you give people?
If you want to live and you want to make sure you get through this, you should stay home as much as possible. You should wear a mask when you're out in public. And when people tell you that, you can choose to educate them. You can laugh. You can do whatever feels right. But you must wear masks out in public. It is the only way we're going to minimize the number of infections.
Yeah. See, I told them, you just turn around and go, I'm leaving, bye. And don't go back. Stupid.
I'm out of here, baby.
That's it. I'm turned tailing and running. But Dr. Sennholz, I appreciate the time, the expertise. Thank you for your continued support of our work and for keeping us up to date.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
You as well. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you run into this where you go into a store and someone tells you that it's all a hoax and you shouldn't bother? Kind of stupid if you think about it. Quick break. Right back. Stick around.
Saving work in America, one show at a time. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1863. That was the day the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry marched through the streets of Boston in a farewell parade and then boarded ships headed for Beaufort, South Carolina. Thousands lined the streets for the send-off, including prominent abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass. It was the first black regiment organized to fight in the Civil War. Abolitionists had wrestled with Lincoln and others that the Civil War wasn't just about preventing national disintegration, but about ending the slave labor system. They were emphatic that slaves and free black men had a right and a vested interest in fighting for their freedoms and the freedoms of their families. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 codified that demand as it abolished the slave system. The Union Army Army began accepting black enlistees and embarked on recruitment campaigns to enlist future black soldiers. By May, over 1,000 black men had enlisted from 24 states. Others came from as far away as Canada and the Caribbean. Fathers and sons enlisted together. The Union Army was far from free from its own anti-black prejudices. Secretary of War Edward Stanton determined white officers would lead all black regiments. Nonetheless, black enlisted men were trained, armed, and ready to fight. A young Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was put in charge of the regiment. Though Shaw and hundreds of troops would soon be killed in the Battle of Fort Wagner, the regiment forced the Confederacy to abandon the fort altogether. The Swamp Angels, as they were called, would continue to exact justice throughout the South for the duration of the war. They served as a model for other black regiments whose fighting proved decisive for victory. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at laborhistoryin2.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So, like Kelly was saying, one of the concerns is that you end up getting one of these super spreaders to involved in protest in a meeting room. You get them somewhere where they end up spreading this, and they end up causing more people to have contact. And then they end up taking it back, and then it's just this horrible game. And it's one of those moments where I'm looking at Pennsylvania, and the big story that broke yesterday was evidently a state rep here in our Commonwealth, and I talked about it a little bit yesterday. A guy named Andrew Lewis. Evidently, he tested positive. Didn't bother to. I guess told the leadership. There was some voluntary kind of maybe quarantining, a whole bunch of who knows at this point. And ultimately you had the Republicans not bothering to tell the Democrats that there was anything going on. They were hiding it. And this is one of those moments where you go, it's sad, but clear that the Republican leadership didn't even care about their own colleagues, let alone we the people. And here to share some thoughts on this story and maybe fill in some of the blanks, I've asked our good friend, Pennsylvania State Representative Pat Harkins, to come talk with us. Pat, thanks for taking time for us.
Good evening, Rick. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So walk me through this. I understand this Republican representative, Andrew Lewis. He's now positive. He's I guess gone to a couple of things, been around some folks. Tells leadership he's sick. He goes home. What happens then?
I was alerted to it yesterday by a media person who called me to get my reaction to it. We all were exposed, evidently, and I believe after speaking with another colleague tonight that the floor debate's still going on right now for those who want to watch it on PCN. It's a three-ring circus, and it's cover your butt as best as you can. But I left Harrisburg last Thursday. I had to pick up my sister the next morning, who I'm a caregiver for. She has congestive heart failure, and I took her to Hammett Hospital in Erie. I wheeled her in and met up with 6 or 7 other people that I knew there. I had my mask on and doing what was needed. But how many people did I infect unknowingly? And then again on Memorial Day weekend, I encountered neighbors. I encountered friends. I drove back down to Harrisburg and stopped at a gas station. How many other people did I convey this to or possibly inflict with this? It's just absurd.
No,
and then
to
have them, they want to walk it back, and they don't want it to turn into a national issue, and it already is. And I think the people of Pennsylvania are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? These people are elected to do our bidding, and in the meantime, they're skirting around the rules and playing rough and fast with the rules.
No, and these are the people who are screaming, reopen, reopen. And yet in their ranks, they've got a case that they're covering up. And, how many people did they endanger? And like you said, how many people did you come in contact with? Vulnerable people. How many lives could you have really caused severe harm to? I'm of the mindset that this should be criminal.
I believe the same thing. I know people have contacted Attorney General Shapiro, and he says that we should deal with it on our own. But I think as this goes a little bit further, there may be some more action that people are going to take a closer look at. And again, I think there are people in the House right now that are contagious that don't want to come forward. That's what my fear is.
And the fear is it's not just, and this is why, I keep coming back to, we've really got to protect ourselves. This is where common sense, this is where rational thought is so important. And the reason that, even someone like me wears a mask when I go out in public, because I want to make sure that I'm protected, because you never know. You never know how many of these people are that you're going to just bump into, are going to not be sick, but be carrying what they've got.
That's it. You just don't know the unknown.
It's just crazy. Now, any discussion of, because my mind immediately went to in Harrisburg, you had probably the biggest reopen protest, whatever group in the country show up. Did any of these people speak at that event? Were any of those folks there? Because my mind immediately went to, you've got Russ Ding Dong Diamond, who I'm not a fan of, who was exposed to this guy, whether he's sick or not, we don't know. But there's a guy who never misses a crowd, especially of these lockheads. How many of those people could be sick?
He was the ringleader for that. I saw that, and they played that again, I think, on CNN this evening. But he was there at that rally screaming, he's got it now, and he was in the House last week. I walked right by him. So you're in a room with that person. How many people did he spread that to, and did he catch it at that rally that he was so concerned with, and that they had to push that Trump agenda?
Yeah, I mean it's angering, and it's one of these things where I think people need to, at this point, we need to be holding people accountable, and there should be heads rolling from the top. And I look at the speaker as the way I've understood this, and obviously you're there, you'll know it better than I do. It's my understanding that this Representative Lewis went to the leadership, told him that this was going on, and they covered it up. Is that accurate?
That's the understanding that I have, but now we're hearing that there's a rift between Representative Cutler and Speaker Turzai as to who wants to take the blame and who should take the blame. And in the meantime, Representative Schleger-Culver sits next to this gentleman who came forward, and he didn't tell her as he was sitting next to her through all these days of being contagious. I noticed she wasn't there today. She's a very great, sensible, level-headed Republican who I work very well with, and I feel awful for her because she's got to be thinking in her mind, what was I exposed to? Who did I come in contact with? And what role does she play in it now, through no fault of her own?
Just incredible. Now, isn't the message out of this, maybe we can't believe anything they tell us anymore? Because, obviously they were pushing for a reopen faster. They were pushing Trump's agenda. You had Russ Diamond saying that he wasn't going to wear a mask, pushing that kind of a messaging. Is the message here that these folks just aren't, they're not ready for prime time?
That's it in a nutshell. But the most embarrassing and insulting thing is, right now we're debating and going to vote on a Russ Diamond resolution to open everything up. Say the hell with everything. We don't have anything in place. One of my colleagues just spoke from Allentown and said how he'll be a red hotspot for a long time because that's a very lively action area with the germ. And this resolution would open all that up. This would open up Philadelphia, Bucks County, Allentown, Erie, everybody. With no safeguards in place in some of these places. Some of these rural areas are bragging that they don't have high numbers, but they don't realize that people bringing product back and forth in and out they're going to be the ones spreading it into their communities, and they don't have the hospital systems to deal with it or handle those kind of things.
Yeah, and as
But
we've been
it's very
talking,
short-sightedness.
yeah, and as we've been talking about here today, the idea of someone being a super spreader, because as the studies are now saying that 10% of the people who of the cases that there are responsible for 80% of the people getting sick. So you've got a handful of people who are usually the most obnoxious, the least concerned for others, being the ones who spread it to everybody else and end up screwing things up for the rest of us.
The loudmouth bullies. It's so plain and obvious. It's sickening. But then when you factor in that the fact that we could be unknowingly spreading this through no fault of any of ours, but these few idiots that think that they should bully their way through and be the loudest ones to get their agenda through.
It's just
very frustrating, very disappointing. As an elected official, you're there to be responsible and do the will of the people, and not to play games with people and put people's lives in jeopardy.
No, and at a time when people are looking to you for leadership, and this is where my frustration is. This is where my big frustration with Donald Trump and the Republicans as a whole has been, in that in these times of crisis, you're looking for sane, rational, steady leadership. You're looking for good messaging. You can think that wearing a mask is a hoax and it's nonsense, but you do it anyway because you want the majority of people to go, hey, we need you to take care of yourself. And you can see me doing it, and even if you just take it off when you leave the camera, it's sending that message. So to have someone like Diamond, to have someone like Trump, who are out there saying absolutely not, under no circumstances, what message does that send to everybody else?
It's disgusting, and no regard for their fellow employee, their fellow colleagues. It's very disheartening to see that these are the kind of people that are elected, and then you wonder who elects them. What do those constituents think? I know my constituents would throw me out of my ear, and I would never do anything like this. It's humiliating. And to have to serve with people like this really makes you wonder, what kind of people do we have that are electing these kind of people?
Excellent point. Let me ask you a last line of questioning, because we don't know who's sick now. Are you guys going through a testing regime? I mean, is there going to be every person tested, whether you show symptoms or not, that were around these? Because what we're finding out is, there are people who are carriers who may not have any symptoms. Are you guys doing any of that?
That's what we requested, and it fell on deaf ears. We asked as the Rules Committee for the Democratic group if we could have testing done, if we could have masks required on the House floor, and it's met with a stonewall. I mean, it's just push it off, like they do with everything else they don't want to run.
So even in the face of all of this,
Rick,
so even in the face of all of
safety
this,
bill. Yeah, we're trying to get that bill 1082 going again, because when the PennDOT workers and the AFSCME workers come back to work, they have no repercussions. So if people tell them go to OSHA to report issues with your employee or your employment, there are no safeguards in place. That's come to mind 4 or 5 times in the last week, where constituents would call me and they're back to work with state positions, but they don't have any OSHA protection. And they ask me what to do, and I give them these people's names. Call these members of the Labor Committee who are stonewalling this thing because they think it's another mandate that's going to cost them more money. But put the money and the dollar value over the value of people's lives.
Just absolutely maddening and insane. So, last question I've got for you: What do you want us to do? I mean, ultimately, I'm enraged, but what do you want folks to do?
I would tell people, just keep pounding away at these people's office phone numbers. Call them and tell them they've had enough of it. And next Tuesday's election day. Go out and speak with your voice if you haven't voted by mail already. But by God, we've got to stand up for what's right, and we've got to start doing the right thing and sticking up for the right person. That's what I'm there for, the working person who has no voice. And I feel like I don't anymore.
And that's a sad testament to where we are. Pat, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the work you do. Keep it up. I look forward to having you back again as this continues down the road.
Thank you, Rick, and I appreciate you bringing issues like this to the forefront.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Our good friend, Pennsylvania State Representative Pat Harkins. This is a disgrace. I mean, Pennsylvania's, a bunch of things. But this is disgraceful. And under the leadership of Mike Turdzeye, this again is more of a disgrace. But again, anybody surprised? Honestly, anybody surprised that they're callous liars and cheats? No. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back.
Waving the flag of freedom for people, not corporations. Rick Smith.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1882. That was the day that John Muir, a Scottish-American conservationist, founded the Sierra Club in San Francisco, California. The Sierra Club's purpose was to explore, enjoy, and protect the wild places of the earth. Today, the organization has more than 1 million members and is one of the most well-known environmental organizations on the planet. The labor movement and the environmental movements in the United States have not always had an easy relationship. Too often, politicians and the media have framed policy decisions as a choice between good jobs and a clean environment. But during the 1990s, some environmentalists and unionists began to break down this divide. Both groups opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement, arguing it would have a negative impact on both jobs and the environment. During the massive protests of the World Trade Organization in 1999 in Seattle, labor protested alongside environmental activists. One memorable tagline to come out of the protests was, "Turtles love Teamsters, Teamsters love turtles." Then, in 2006, the Sierra Club partnered with the United Steelworkers to launch the Blue-Green Alliance. The effort joins together blue-collar workers with green environmental justice groups. The partnership seeks to supply policy and education about sustainable job growth in fields such as clean energy. Multiple environmental groups and unions, including the American Federation of Teachers, the Communication Workers of America, the Service Employees International Union, and the United Auto Workers, have signed on to the effort. But it's not always easy to keep the two causes united. In 2012, the Laborers Union left the alliance due to disagreements over the Keystone XL pipeline. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So the Department of Labor today came out with some new numbers. Another 2.1 million initial unemployment compensation claims filed last week. That brings the 10-week total up to 40.7 million folks filing for unemployment. We are in a major, major problem. And this is, again, one of these moments where it's who's in elected office that's going to make things better or worse. And the reason that I reach out to people running in different districts, because there are people that are in those seats that I really don't like. And one of those is the guy who's running in this latest election against someone who I really don't like. And her name is Debbie Lasko. She is the one of the heavy 40. She was one of the 40 Republicans who voted against the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. This is her claim to fame. And I'll be honest, this is the main reason this woman has to go, in my view. But here to share some thoughts on why he thinks she should go and why he's running in Arizona's 8th Congressional District, I've asked Michael Moscato to come talk with us. Michael, thanks for taking time for us.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Appreciate it.
So I'm looking at this, these unemployment numbers are just through the roof and insane. And I'm looking at a number of these Republicans, the woman that you're running against being one of them, who said, we don't need to make sure that people get tests. We don't need to make sure that there's help for working families. I'm really struggling with what you do with these people.
Well, unfortunately, Rick, I've lived a third of my entire life with the woman that I'm running against as my representative. So the answer to your question of what do you do with these people is you stand up for your family, you stand up for your hometown, and you stand up for yourself and your children's future, and you run against them. You put them to the test, stand on their terrible record over a decade of failing Arizona families, and you pointed out the most recent one and perhaps the most egregious when you vote against the Families First Act in a time of one of our nation's darkest hours. And that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to represent the people of this district, which have gone misrepresented for my entire life. I haven't had a Democratic representative in the 36 years I've been alive here in this town. And we need to finish the job this November. This election was competitive last cycle, and I'm here to finish the job.
Because, the reason I think this is an important moment is I think it was Maya Angelou who said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. I think her vote tells us who she is. She doesn't care about working families. This is about, making sure that corporations are fat and happy, and while the rest of us kind of screwed. And I like the fact that you've come out and said, look, corporations, you want to help corporations, help the working people. Make sure that the folks at the bottom are taken care of.
Absolutely. When we talk about these unemployment numbers, and I'm a small business owner. I've owned my own small business for 7 years. I've had my own professional career as a video director and crew chief in the music entertainment industry. So you take a family like mine that's grown up here. We have generations of Arizonans here. And my professional career is on hold until probably next year. My small business was closed for 10 weeks. We're just now getting ready to reopen this business and start back to functioning. How do you support these small businesses having any success if you don't give them the piece of the $6.2 trillion? Right. How does a business rehire workers if they don't have the support and they've gone into debt? How do consumers buy products from small businesses if they don't have money? And how do families stay afloat if they have no means of supporting themselves and no assistance from the government or the people supposed to stand up for them? It's not possible, and that's what we're fighting for.
And this is one of those things where there's an opportunity for common ground, maybe just not with the person that you're running against. But I had a very conservative former Congressman Joe Walsh here on the program, and he said, look, we should be paying every person who isn't allowed to go to work at least 90% of their wages. We should be making sure that the working people at the bottom are made whole, which I thought was a huge admission for him. This idea that we make the people at the bottom whole and it'll trickle up to those folks at the top.
Well, Joe points out something that maybe he didn't specifically say, but this is affecting everyone. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's not an independent issue. It's an American issue. All of us are hurting, and we're hurting because of the poor leadership at the top. We're hurting because of policy that has failed us time and time again, and we need the solution, and the solution is stepping in to help Americans get themselves back on their feet. Myself and millions of other small business owners have been pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps for our entire lives. We're not asking for handouts. But in the time where the government steps in and closes our doors and destroys our businesses and destroys our incomes and revenues, that's when we have to step in, and they have to step in and provide us with some sort of solution to get us back on our feet, right, or we'll crumble the entire economy.
No, you're spot on. So what would you do when you're elected? What's the first thing you do as a representative?
Well, I know I had pointed out right when this stuff happened, we needed to freeze the rents and mortgages, whether that was for business owners or for families. We needed to make sure that gig workers, which make up millions of jobs, that weren't able to get unemployment insurance, we needed to make sure that workers were receiving some sort of assistance. When I step in day one, my big push is going to be for health care and then reconstructing this economy. But we need to be careful about when we just say reopen the economy. The reason why the economy failed so drastically is because it was only working for a select group of people in the first place. And it's why we see the stock market still at 25,000, even though 40 million unemployment claims have been made. We have an opportunity now to make jobs work for people, make the economy actually function for the working class American. And we need to do that by replacing the people who are currently in office.
and starting with Ms. Lesko, who, again, I highlight the fact that this woman voted against the Families First Act. How do you do that in a moment of national crisis?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about a couple of other things, because you've brought up a really important point of we need to make sure that the help goes to people who are desperate needing it. I personally have said from the beginning there should not have been a $500 billion trough for corporate America to stick their snouts in. That money should have been given to working people so that they could have stayed home, so that they could continue to support small business and all of that. But health insurance is a huge part of this as well. In the month of April alone, 27 million people across this country lost their health insurance. What's your view on how we deal with that?
Well, this shows the failure of our healthcare system. And I hope people are waking up, whether they're Republican or Democrat, because we cannot be in a situation where just because you lose your job, you lose your means of healthcare coverage. It's a glaring deficiency in our healthcare system. So we need to provide more affordable healthcare. We need to provide more expansive healthcare. We need to make sure that the access is there. There should be a period where if you lose your job, you're still covered without going to COBRA and now paying catastrophic prices that nobody can afford, and it gives you minimal insurance. That's not what our healthcare system is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about servicing the needs of the healthcare of Americans, and we're failing. And to just not have a plan for our friends across the aisle, that's not a plan.
No, I'm right there with you. So do you have something that you would prefer? Do you find yourself on one track or another, or are you pretty much open to the ideas that may come?
Well, I think we need to build off of the Affordable Care Act. I think it's a dangerous and slippery slope to just simply throw out a Medicare for all program, which is, as we've seen our presidential candidates talk about time and time again, that it's going to take years in order to make that happen. And we've seen our friends across the aisle say that any legislation like that is dead upon arrival. And what scares me about that is you're going to have Americans go years of nothing but partisan banter back and forth with nothing getting done, when instead we can take the things that have worked with the ACA and we can keep those, things like protecting pre-existing conditions. And we can build off of the things that we compromised with the ACA. We need to remember, Republicans supported the ACA up until it wasn't theirs. Republicans forced compromise on our president, who was simply trying to get us to move forward because staying where we were wasn't acceptable. We can continue to build off of that, but it's going to take new leaders in office to get the job done, because it requires work. And as we've seen with my opponent, she doesn't even have time to read these bills. I'll show up to work every day and get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is over the last 3.5 years, nothing has been done on health care. Only
Correct.
thing that they really have accomplished is they've weakened what we did have in the ACA. We were told they were going to repeal and replace with something wonderful. They could have still moved forward with a replacement if they actually had a plan, because they don't. And there's nothing in the pipeline, not even the old bad ideas of the past. They didn't even come out with that.
Well, and you touch on something great, which is I've heard and seen some of their ideas. A lot of them involve HSAs and involve private insurances through things like churches or other groups. And my point right now is, who has an extra $8,000 in their bank account to put into an HSA? Most of the people in this country don't have $400 in their bank account. So HSAs aren't realistic for people, the majority of people in this country.
Right.
God forbid something happens, you burn through that immediately. The other problem is, when we talk about going to all these different private insurances, they're all doing the same thing, that when you talk about a universal health care plan, they're trying to gather a bunch of people and spread the cost out amongst that group of people. Well, why don't we use the 325 million people that are called Americans as that pot and drive that cost down? That's That's the bigger issue.
No, but isn't that really the argument for the Medicare for All system, that you have one giant insurance pool? And I've often said I don't care if it's private or public, but just the common sense having one giant pool where everybody's in it seems to make sense to me.
Well, a single payer system that eliminates a lot of the administration costs, which are they're just an abuse of our money. We don't need to have 1,000 different private insurances with 1,000 different ways to code and bill. We don't need that. That's driving up costs. We don't need to have prescription drugs spending 30% of their margin on advertising costs. We don't need those commercials that threaten us with death and side effects on our televisions. We can save massive amounts of money. But we can also offer people private insurances if that's what they want. I got to tell you, Rick, I'm yet to come across somebody who says, I love my health care plan. I haven't had it. But if there are people out there that maybe I haven't come into in all these years of engaging with people, then, hey, you can keep your plan. But let's provide a plan that covers you at 100% and is and is actually affordable, and let's make those companies compete with that. If they can do it, then they're in business. But when we talk about free markets, hey, the power of the people can speak. Let's let these people compete. That's what they want to talk about, then compete with the rest of us.
No, it's an excellent point you make, because I hear a lot of people talking about on the education front, we want public and private interests competing, but not in the healthcare field. And it's kind of an interesting kind of juxtaposition, because on one hand they're all for the free market, they're all for competition, but when it comes to actually having a public plan that people might want, because I think if you opened up Medicare, I think people would buy into it in a heartbeat. They don't so much want that. Which leads me to education, because being from Arizona where you're at, you had the whole Red for Ed movement that went on there. In fact, we had teachers on the program while the strikes were going on in place, because Arizona is one of the states that's got one of the lowest teacher salaries in the country. Education spending is pretty poor there. From a congressional point of view, how do you help your state increase education funding and thus opportunity for students?
Well, when you touched on it earlier, the argument has been between school choice. That's the hot button topic, right? And I've said for years, as somebody I'm born and raised here. Both of my parents were public school teachers here in Arizona for 30 plus years. I attended both private and public schools out here. I graduated from a public high school, went to the community college. So I have an experience with both. I can tell you this, well-funded public schools are just as top-notch as any private school you could do. And we, the taxpayers, are paying for that anyway. So why would we not want our taxpayer money to go to good use? When I talk to parents and we talk about school choice, it's not about choice. It's about them wanting their kids to have the best education possible.
Yep.
But when we have people like Betsy DeVos trying to strip away funding, taking taxpayer money away from public schools and to private schools, when we have Debbie Lesko and the ALEC group out here in Arizona stripping money away and directing them to private schools, that is taking away from the education and the success of our children. It's in the state legislation to fund these schools. It's in the Constitution to follow that rule. They need to do it. As a congressional member, I control about 14-15% of the education budget here in terms of the vote. We need to fund things like special education. It's ridiculous what's going on. We need to make sure that our schools aren't crumbling. This state in particular seems to be proud of being 48th in education year after year. Yeah. And I can tell you our teachers deserve better pay. Our students coming out of college deserve to start their life without being in debt that they're going to pay over the next 30 years at the rate that they're getting paid. We got a lot of work to do, Rick. We got a lot of work.
No, and look, we need pro-worker, pro-family legislators in our halls of power and people who are going to stand up for working folks. So last question I've got for you, and I throw this out to every candidate. One, why would you want to throw yourself in the middle of all this? And two, what's the issue that you die on?
I'm throwing myself into this because our country and our hometowns are always worth fighting for. 2 months ago, I had a vision of what my children's future was going to look like, and it involved me coaching Little League baseball and watching them grow up and hopefully playing professional baseball like I did, getting married, living a great life. And as I sit here today, Rick, I don't have a clue what my children's future looks like. I don't know what my own future looks like. I don't know what my friends and families and my fellow Americans' futures look like. I just watched a man get murdered with the cameras rolling in the year 2020 by a police officer. I'm watching the President of the United States attack a social media platform and try to fight small businesses and destroy this country. Everything's at stake here. So when you ask, why am I doing this? It's because this is no longer about me. It's not about my generation. It's about my kids. And I will die on the issue of making sure that my children live a better life than I've lived, and that they'll have access to good education, to health care, and to a future. And I'll, with my last breath, I'll fight till the very end. And I can tell you this, we're going to get this job done here, and we're going to make history in AZ08. So I appreciate you having me on.
I appreciate the time, and I hope you'll come back and share some more thoughts as the campaign rolls along. But Michael, thank you again. I wish you the best. Good luck, buddy.
Thanks, Rick. You take care.
Again, if you want to check out Michael Moscato's website, Moscato for Congress, the number 4congress.com. We'll get links out on social media how you can check that out. Good stuff. Let's take a quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Saving work in America, one show at a time. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1946. That was the day the working people of New York stood up in true labor solidarity. It all started at the stroke of midnight on May 15th, as messengers delivered the following statement to 489 municipal employees. This is to advise you that the position you held in the Department of Public Works has been abolished by the city manager, and your services with the city of Rochester are terminated as of midnight this date. This action is the result of a change of policy deemed necessary to protect public interest. What was the workers' so-called act against public interest? Trying to form a union. Earlier that May, city workers had founded the Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 871, as part of the AFL. The next day, 500 city workers crowded into the Carpenters Hall to figure out what to do next. Teamsters Locals 118 and 398 pledged their support. The area labor councils of both the AFL and CIO met to plan their response. On May 20th, labor called for a public protest and 24-hour-a-day pickets of the Department of Public Works. The next day, 54 picketers were arrested. Finally, at 3 a.m. on this day in labor history, a citywide general strike was declared. Newspaper presses fell silent and buses did not run. More than 13,000 members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union walked off the job. In all, more than 30,000 workers joined the strike. After one day, the city gave in. They agreed to reinstate the fired workers and recognize their right to form a union. Today, public unions are again under attack, and labor solidarity is more important than ever. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So, wow, what a packed 2 hours this has been. Two and really good candidates. I hope you check out both of them, Michael Moscato, moscatoforcongress.com, and also Sarah Riggs Amico, Sarah for Georgia. And look, you know, this is the opportunity to completely change over the political landscape in which we find ourselves, especially in the Senate. The opportunity to flip 2 Georgia Senate seats, historic. I mean, if you win both of those, the chances of taking the Senate and potentially the White House and keeping the House, maybe we can get some sane stuff done. Maybe we can actually start moving towards ensuring that all workers get access to health care. Maybe we can start talking about ensuring that we have safe workplaces. Maybe we can start talking about actually doing something. Wow, wouldn't that be great? Instead of, hey, we had our twiddler in chief signed an idiotic executive order because he had a temper tantrum. Wouldn't you much rather be moving forward than having this kind of chaos? I know I sure would. Anyway, if you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com is where you get the podcast. The Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go wherever you go. And as always, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you back here next time.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Email Rick at rick@thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.